Snow fell steadily, blanketing the small town of Snowbridge in a serene yet biting cold. Christmas lights twinkled in windows, their colors dancing on the icy streets, as though determined to stave off the darkness of a frigid December night. Yet for Jack Miller, the warmth of those lights felt like a taunt. Once a decorated firefighter and local hero, Jack now spent his days driving a taxi and his nights in solitude, a shadow of the man he used to be. The scars from a devastating accident, both visible and hidden, had pushed him away from his family and the community he once cherished. The quiet rhythm of the road was Jack's only solace. The hum of the engine and the crunch of tires over snow provided a fragile barrier between him and his past. Tonight, the streets were nearly empty, with the forecast warning of an impending blizzard. Having just dropped off his last passenger, Jack decided to head home early. The prospect of returning to his empty cabin wasn't inviting, but at least there, no one expected him to smile. The headlights of his cab carved through the darkness, illuminating the winding road ahead. He was nearing the outskirts of town when something caught his eye. A dark shape lay motionless in the middle of the snowy path, faintly outlined against the white. Jack slowed the car, squinting to make out the object. As he approached, the shape stirred. It wasn't debris or trash, as he had first assumed. It was a dog. He stopped abruptly, the tires skidding slightly on the icy road. The animal was large, its fur matted with snow and what looked like dried blood. It struggled to its feet, wobbling on unsteady legs. Jack hesitated, gripping the steering wheel tightly. He didn't want to stop. He didn't want to get involved. But the dog's eyes locked onto his, pleading in a way that pierced through his armor. With a sigh of resignation, Jack opened the door. "All right, buddy, let's get you out of here," he muttered, his breath visible in the freezing air. Moving closer, he crouched down and reached for the dog, which recoiled slightly but lacked the strength to resist. Jack could feel it shivering as he scooped it up carefully and carried it to the back seat of the cab. "Hang in there," he murmured, closing the door and returning to the driver's seat. The dog let out a weak whine as Jack turned the car around and headed home. Back at his cabin, Jack set to work. He laid the dog on an old blanket by the fireplace, the soft glow of the flames reflecting off its damp coat. Its fur was mostly black, with streaks of brown and white that might have been beautiful under different circumstances. Jack noticed a leather collar around its neck and flipped it over to read the inscription. Max? No phone number or address, just the name. "Max, huh?" Jack said softly. The dog blinked up at him, its amber eyes glassy with exhaustion but somehow still alert. "Well, Max, you've had a rough night." Jack fetched a first aid kit from the closet and began cleaning the dog's wounds. It flinched at his touch, but made no effort to bite or resist. As he worked, Jack's thoughts drifted to the past, to another time when helping someone in need had felt like second nature. Now, the simple act of patching up a dog felt like wading through a river of memories he wasn't ready to confront. Once Max was bandaged, Jack sat back and observed him. There was something unusual about the dog. Despite its injuries, Max seemed highly aware of his surroundings, his ears twitching at every creak of the cabin. Jack noticed, too, how the dog's gaze lingered on certain objects in the room, particularly an old fireman's helmet resting on a shelf. "You've got good instincts," Jack said, almost chuckling. "Or maybe you're just nosy." Max didn't respond, of course, but his steady stare was unsettlingly knowing. It was as if the dog understood more than he should. Jack dismissed the thought as exhaustion creeping in. He fed Max a small portion of leftover chicken and settled him in by the fire before retreating to his own chair. As the hours passed and the snowstorm outside intensified, Jack found himself drawn to Max's quiet resilience. The dog's presence was oddly comforting, filling a void Jack hadn't realized was so gaping. Yet, a nagging question remained. Where had Max come from, and why had he been left in such a state? By the time Jack drifted off to sleep in his chair, the dog's steady breathing had blended with the crackle of the fire, wrapping the room in a fragile sense of peace. But deep down, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that Max's arrival was no coincidence, and that his quiet life in Snowbridge was about to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The snowstorm continued to rage outside, but inside Jack Miller's small cabin, The crackling fire cast a warm glow over the room. Max, the injured dog, lay curled up on the makeshift bed of blankets. His chest rose and fell steadily now, a stark contrast to the labored breaths of the night before. Jack sat at the kitchen table, staring at a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. The dog's presence, though silent, filled the space with an odd sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Over the next few days, Max's strength began to return. Jack had taken to talking to the dog while going about his routine, as if Max were a silent confidant. The dog seemed to listen intently, tilting his head at the sound of Jack's voice, his amber eyes alert and curious. It was unnerving at first, but eventually, Jack found it oddly comforting. "You're more attentive than most people I've met," Jack muttered one morning as he prepared breakfast. Max sat nearby, his gaze unwavering. "Not that I'm much of a conversationalist these days." Jack avoided the town whenever he could, but Max's recovery forced him to make an exception. The cabin was running low on supplies, and Max needed proper food, maybe even a checkup. Reluctantly, Jack loaded the dog into the cab and drove into Snowbridge. The town's main street was bustling, the snowstorm having finally eased. Children built snowmen while their parents chatted over cups of coffee from the local cafe. It was a scene Jack once would have enjoyed, back when he was a part of this community. Now, he kept his head down as he entered the general store, Max trotting faithfully at his side. Inside, the store owner, Martha, greeted him with a mix of surprise and concern. "Jack Miller, as I live and breathe. It's been a while. And who's this handsome fella?" "This is Max," Jack said gruffly, avoiding her gaze as he picked up a bag of dog food. Max, ever the diplomat, wagged his tail and nudged Martha's hand, earning a delighted laugh. "Well, aren't you a charmer?" she said, scratching behind Max's ears. "Where'd you find him?" "Middle of the road during the storm. Looked like he'd been out there a while," Jack replied. His tone clipped. He didn't want to linger on the details. As he paid for the supplies, Martha hesitated. "You know, Jack, folks here still care about you. You should come around more often. It'd do you good." Jack didn't respond. Instead, he muttered a quick thanks and left. Outside, he leaned against the cab, his breath visible in the cold air. Max pressed against his leg, as if sensing his unease. "Don't get too comfortable," Jack told the dog, though his voice lacked conviction. "I'm not exactly a people person." Despite his efforts to maintain distance, Max had a way of drawing people in. Over the following days, neighbors stopped by the cabin, ostensibly to check on the dog, but always lingering for a chat. A retired teacher brought treats for Max and stayed to tell stories of her late husband. A young boy from down the road came by with a hand-drawn Christmas card for the dog, shyly asking if he could pet him. Each interaction chipped away at the walls Jack had built around himself, though he refused to acknowledge it. Max, meanwhile, seemed to thrive on the attention, his tail wagging furiously at every visitor. One afternoon, Jack noticed something odd about the dog. Max had been playing with a ball near the fireplace when his behavior shifted. He stood still, his ears perked, staring at a small box on the mantel. Jack followed his gaze and felt his stomach tighten. The box contained his old firefighter badge and a few mementos from his time in the field. "You don't want to go there, buddy," Jack muttered, picking up the box and tucking it away in a drawer. But the memories were already flooding back. The fire, the screams, the moment he realized he couldn't save everyone. It was the moment that had cost him everything: his career, his family, and his sense of self. That night, as Jack lay awake, he found himself thinking about Sarah and Emily. His ex-wife had always been the anchor in his chaotic life, and Emily, now 8, had been his reason to keep going. But after the accident, Jack had pushed them away, convinced they were better off without him. On the table sat an unopened envelope with Sarah's handwriting on it. The words "Christmas dinner" stared back at him. Jack had avoided making a decision about whether to go, but Max seemed to have other plans. The dog nudged the envelope repeatedly with his nose until Jack finally sighed and picked it up. "You don't quit, do you?" he said, scratching behind Max's ears. The dog's tail thumped against the floor in response. Jack wasn't ready to face his family, but he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that Max had entered his life for a reason. As he pondered this, an unexpected development occurred. While walking Max near the edge of town, Jack noticed the dog freeze, his posture alert. Following Max's lead, Jack spotted something partially buried in the snow, a small emblem attached to a piece of torn fabric. It bore the insignia of a search and rescue team. Jack's heart raced as he realized what it meant. Max wasn't just any dog. He had been trained for rescue missions. The discovery unsettled Jack. It brought back memories of his own time as a rescuer and the weight of knowing that he had failed when it mattered most. But Max's training also raised questions. Where had the dog come from, and what had happened to his handler? That night, as the storm began to pick up again, Jack found himself unable to sleep. Max lay at his feet, calm but watchful, as though sensing the storm brewing inside and out. Jack felt a pang of guilt for avoiding the invitation from Sarah and Emily. The thought of seeing his daughter again filled him with both longing and dread. Max, however, seemed to have made up his mind. He retrieved the envelope from the table and dropped it in Jack's lap, his gaze firm and expectant. "All right, I get it," Jack said, a reluctant smile breaking through. "Maybe it's time to stop running." Unbeknownst to Jack, the biggest storm of all was yet to come. The snowstorm arrived with a ferocity Snowbridge hadn't seen in years. Winds howled through the narrow streets, carrying sheets of snow that obscured visibility. The once bustling town square was now eerily quiet, buried under layers of white. Jack stood by the window of his cabin, watching the storm rage. The crackling fire in the hearth did little to thaw the growing unease in his chest. Max lay by his feet, alert and watchful as though he could sense what was coming. Jack had spent the morning grappling with the discovery of Max's search and rescue training. The insignia he'd found confirmed that the dog had once been part of a professional team, but it also raised unsettling questions. What had happened to Max's handler? Why had the dog been alone, injured, in the middle of the road? Jack tried to push the questions aside, but they lingered, clawing at the edges of his thoughts. As the storm intensified, the piercing sound of Jack's phone broke the silence. He picked it up hesitantly, the name on the screen sending a jolt through him. Sarah, his ex-wife, rarely called, and when she did, it was usually about Emily. A sinking feeling settled in his stomach as he answered. "Jack," Sarah's voice was laced with panic. Emily's school bus didn't make it home. They were taking the mountain road to avoid the highway closure, but Jack's heart dropped. The mountain road? In this storm? "Yes," Sarah interrupted, her voice breaking. "The police said the bus slid off the road. They're stranded, and the snow's too heavy for anyone to reach them. Jack, please. You're the only one who—" "I'll go," Jack said before she could finish. He didn't need to hear more. The thought of Emily out there, scared and alone, cut through the wall he'd spent years building around himself. He hung up and grabbed his old firefighting gear from the closet. The sight of it sent a wave of nausea through him, memories of the fire that had ended his career rushing back. His hands trembled as he adjusted the straps, but then he felt a nudge at his side. Max stood there, steady and resolute, his amber eyes filled with an unspoken determination. "You're not staying behind, are you?" Jack muttered, managing a faint smile. He grabbed the flashlight and opened the door, bracing himself against the blast of cold wind. Together, he and Max stepped into the storm. The drive to the mountain road was harrowing. Snow whipped against the windshield, and the icy roads made every turn treacherous. Jack gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white, as he followed the faint tracks left by the bus. Max sat in the passenger seat, his ears perked, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. After what felt like an eternity, Jack spotted the bus. It was tilted precariously at the edge of a ravine, half buried in snow. The sight sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the weather. He parked the cab a safe distance away and climbed out, his boots sinking into the deep snow. Max leapt out after him, moving with an agility that belied the storm's intensity. Jack approached the bus cautiously, calling out to the driver. A man's voice answered, shaky but audible. "We're okay for now, but the kids are scared. The back tires are slipping. Any more weight and we'll go over." Jack assessed the situation, his mind racing. The snow was piling up quickly, and the steep incline of the road made it impossible for emergency vehicles to reach them. It was up to him. His old training kicked in, pushing aside the fear that threatened to paralyze him. "All right, stay calm," he called back. "I'm going to get the kids out one by one." But as he moved closer, a loud crack echoed through the air. The sound of snow shifting above them made his stomach drop. An avalanche was imminent. "Max!" Jack shouted, instinctively pointing to the bus. The dog sprang into action, weaving through the snow with remarkable precision. He leapt onto the bus, barking sharply to draw the children's attention. Inside, the kids began to stir, their tear-streaked faces peeking out through fogged-up windows. Jack climbed onto the bus, his voice firm but reassuring. "All right, kids, listen to me. We're going to get you out of here, but you have to follow Max. He's going to lead you to safety." One by one, Jack helped the children out of the bus, guiding them into the swirling storm where Max waited. The dog moved with unwavering confidence, leading the group to a small outcropping of rocks that offered temporary shelter. Jack worked quickly, his breath visible in the freezing air, as he carried the younger children and reassured the older ones. When all the children were safe, Jack turned his attention to Emily. She was huddled in the back of the bus, clutching her backpack tightly. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice trembling. Jack felt a lump rise in his throat. "I'm here, Em. I've got you." He scooped her up and carried her out, shielding her from the biting wind as they made their way to the others. But just as he reached the shelter, a deafening roar filled the air. The avalanche had begun. Snow cascaded down the mountain, a massive white wall hurtling toward them. Jack's heart pounded as he ushered Emily into the group of children, positioning himself between them and the oncoming snow. Max, however, didn't hesitate. The dog darted back into the open, barking fiercely to draw Jack's attention. Jack turned in time to see Max standing on the ridge, his body tense, his gaze locked on the falling snow. "Max, no!" Jack shouted, his voice breaking. The dog didn't move. Instead, he barked again, a sharp, commanding sound that seemed to say, "Trust me." At the last moment, Max sprang into action, running along the ridge and triggering a smaller section of snow to break away. The diversion worked, redirecting the avalanche just enough to spare the group. When the snow finally settled, silence fell over the mountain. Jack's chest heaved as he scanned the area, his heart sinking when he didn't see Max. "Max," he called, his voice hoarse. He searched frantically, digging through the snow with his bare hands until he found the dog, half buried but alive. Jack pulled Max into his arms, tears streaming down his face. "You saved us," he whispered. Max's tail thumped weakly in response before his eyes closed. The air was still. The storm finally abated, leaving the mountain cloaked in a haunting silence. Snowbridge's emergency lights, faint but resolute, blinked through the distance as Jack cradled Max's limp form in his arms. The dog was alive, but his breaths were shallow, his body battered from the avalanche's force. Jack's heart clenched as he whispered, "Hold on, Max. We're not done yet." Around him, the children huddled together, their faces pale but safe. Emily clung to his leg, her small fingers gripping tightly. "Daddy, is Max going to be okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jack forced a smile, brushing a hand gently over her hair. "He's tough, just like you. We'll get him help." Gathering his strength, Jack rallied the children. With Max wrapped in his jacket, he led them carefully down the snowy slope, following the trail etched into the snow by the dog earlier. Each step was grueling, the weight of Max and the responsibility for the children pressing heavily on Jack's shoulders. But the thought of Emily's trust in him and Max's courage propelled him forward. As they neared the edge of the mountain road, flashing red and blue lights came into view. Rescue teams swarmed the area, their voices calling out through the aftermath of the storm. Relief washed over Jack as the first responders reached them, taking the children into their care. "You did good, Jack," said Sheriff Bennett, his gruff voice soft with gratitude. "Real good," Jack nodded, his gaze dropping to Max. "We need a vet, now." At the Snowbridge Animal Clinic, Jack sat in the waiting room, his hands clenched into fists. Emily sat beside him, her small hand resting on his arm. "Max will be okay, won't he?" she asked again, her wide eyes filled with hope. Jack hesitated, glancing toward the treatment room door. He's a fighter, Em. If anyone can pull through, it's Mac. Minutes stretched into an agonizing eternity until the veterinarian, Dr. Cole, emerged. Her expression was cautious but not grim, and Jack's chest tightened with a flicker of hope. He's stable, she said. He's hurt, but he'll recover with time and care. You brought him in just in time. The relief that washed over Jack was overwhelming. Emily let out a small cheer, throwing her arms around him. You saved him, Daddy. No, Jack said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Max saved all of us. The following days were a whirlwind. News of Jack and Max's rescue efforts spread through Snowbridge, turning the once reclusive ex-firefighter into the talk of the town. Neighbors and strangers alike stopped by the cabin, bringing meals and supplies. Jack, though uncomfortable with the attention, found himself opening up, bit by bit. It was as though Max had unlocked something in him that had been buried under years of guilt and grief. Sarah and Emily became regular visitors, the barriers between them beginning to thaw. On Christmas morning, they arrived with a small, decorated tree and a stack of presents. Emily's excitement was contagious as she darted into the cabin, her eyes lighting up at the sight of Max resting comfortably by the fire. Look, Max, she exclaimed, holding up a red bow. You're part of the family now. Jack watched as Emily gently tied the bow around Max's neck, the dog's tail wagging weakly. For the first time in years, Jack felt a sense of warmth that the fire alone couldn't provide. Sarah stood beside him, her arms crossed, a small smile tugging at her lips. You're different, she said softly. The Jack I knew before. He's starting to come back. Jack's throat tightened. I'm trying, he admitted. For Emily. For you. And because Max reminded me that running away isn't the answer. Sarah reached out, placing a hand on his arm. You don't have to do it alone, Jack. We're here. Snowbridge held a small ceremony to honor Max and Jack for their bravery. The children from the bus stood proudly in the front row, each holding a candle as they thanked their heroes. Sheriff Bennett presented Jack with a certificate of commendation, but the real moment of pride came when Max received his own recognition. A shiny medal hung gently around his neck, prompting a chorus of cheers from the gathered crowd. After the ceremony, Jack knelt beside Max, who was sitting regally with the medal glinting in the winter sunlight. You earned this, buddy, he said, scratching behind the dog's ears. I don't know how I'll ever repay you. Max licked Jack's hand, as if to say the debt was already paid. As the weeks turned into months, Jack's life took on a new rhythm. He reconnected with the town, volunteering with the local search and rescue team and offering to train with Max, who seemed eager to return to the work he was born to do. Emily spent weekends at the cabin, helping Jack build a small agility course in the backyard for Max, her laughter filling the once quiet space. One evening, after a particularly snowy day, Jack sat on the porch with Max at his side. The stars glittered above, and the town below was a patchwork of warm, glowing lights. Emily's voice carried from inside as she sang along to a Christmas song, her pure, joyful tone melting the last remnants of Jack's self-imposed isolation. You brought me back, Jack said softly, running a hand through Max's fur. I didn't even realize how lost I was until you showed up. Max looked up at him, his tail thumping against the porch. Jack smiled, a deep, genuine smile that felt like the first in years. The dog had done more than save lives that night on the mountain. He had reminded Jack what it meant to live. Epilogue. The following Christmas, Jack stood in the center of Snowbridge's bustling town square, a cup of hot cocoa in one hand and Emily's mittened fingers in the other. Max trotted beside them, his coat shining and his medal still proudly displayed. Sarah joined them, her smile bright as she handed Jack a wrapped gift. Inside was a framed photo. Jack, Emily, and Max sitting together by the fire, their faces glowing with happiness. Merry Christmas, Sarah said, her voice warm. Jack looked at her, then at Emily and Max, and felt a peace he hadn't known in years. Merry Christmas, he replied, his voice steady. This time, he meant it. Thank you very much for watching the video to the end. If you were moved by the story of the canine hero and the spirit of Christmas that transformed lives, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments what you thought of this exciting journey.